The German Sixth Army advances slowly through the hardened mud of Ukraine, a shadow of its former self. Not long ago, this same army had been destroyed at Stalingrad, crushed, frozen, broken like glass in the greatest defeat Germany had ever suffered. Many said it would never return, that the Sixth Army was a name that should be buried, along with the men who died in that cursed city. But Hitler did not allow the ghost to rest. And so, like a body snatched from the grave, the Sixth Army was reborn, no longer led by Paulus, but now under the firm and silent command of General Karl-Adolf, a man known for his toughness and for trying to maintain order, even when everything around him was falling apart. The problem was simple and cruel. This reborn army started out broken. The men moved forward with short, dragging steps, some still wearing clothes they had patched themselves. Many carried tattered uniforms, worn-out boots, and their gaze was the worst. A look of those who had seen hell on earth and knew they were about to see it again. Morale was in tatters, and there was no need to ask why. Every soldier carried the memory of Stalingrad on their back. Some had lost friends, others their sanity, and many their faith. But they marched on. They always marched on, because a German soldier couldn't stop, no matter if his heart was already crushed before the battle even began. As they walked, the wind carried the damp scent of Rio Dnieper, the gigantic, natural wall that Hitler now called the Sacred Line. According to him, the river would become a fortress that no enemy could cross, an impenetrable shield. But when the Sixth Army finally reached the western bank of the Dnieper, it realized a grim truth. There was no fortress at all. There were no walls. There were no prepared defenses. There was only one enormous river, and men too exhausted to dig. The Dnieper stretched before them like a serpent of cold grey water, reflecting the overcast sky. The waves crashed against the bank as if mocking those soldiers who could barely stand. Hollet observed the landscape in silence, his chin stiff, trying to imagine how to transform that waterway into an obstacle capable of holding back the Red Army. Behind them, the distant roar of Soviet artillery served as a terrible reminder. The enemy was coming, quickly, like thunder. Hitler could promise whatever he wanted, but those who were there, face to face with the icy wind of the Dnieper, knew that this unbreakable fortress was nothing more than a dream, perhaps a delusion, of a man who had already lost control. Even so, the Sixth Army, the army that returned from the dead, took a deep breath and began to prepare. They knew that death would come back to claim them, and that this time there might be no rebirth. The race to the Dnieper, extended, epic, bloody, and engaging version. The ground was shaking. Even before the soldiers of the Sixth Army had finished setting up their makeshift camps on the banks of the Dnieper, the distant echo of Soviet artillery began to grow louder, as if the earth itself were giving a warning. They are arriving. With each passing minute, the explosions sounded closer, heavier, more constant. The Soviet offensive advanced like a red wave, pushing everything before it. Entire cities had already been swallowed up. Villages disappeared overnight. And the Germans, along with desperate civilians, wagons, weakened horses, and broken-down trucks, began to crowd the narrow roads leading to the river. It was a retreat, yes, but not an organized retreat. It was an escape, a race for survival. The roads were clogged, an endless line of men, machines, and fear. Trucks sputtered ahead, belching black smoke. Vehicles out of gas were pushed by groups of soldiers who barely had the strength to lift their rifles. Children cried among the carts. Women looked back with wide eyes, expecting to see Soviet columns appearing at any moment. And they often saw it. The metallic roar of the T-34s echoed across the fields. The dust was rising, and the terror began again. German soldiers hastily formed rear lines, attempting to hold off the Soviets for hours, sometimes minutes, just to buy enough time for their own comrades to continue the retreat. It was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. With each kilometer traveled, more bodies were left behind. Some were hit by shrapnel, Others simply collapsed from exhaustion. The sight was so common that few stopped to help. There was no time. The Dnieper lay ahead, and time was as cruel an enemy as the Red Army. From above, the Soviet bombers appeared like birds of prey. Their shadows streaked across the ground, and then the attack would descend. Explosions opened gigantic craters in the road. Trucks flew, soldiers threw themselves to the ground, horses were torn in half. With each bomb, the panic increased. Men ran without knowing where to go. The fear was so palpable it seemed to spring from the very earth. General Hollet, observing the retreat, knew that this was no longer a battle. It was a fight to prevent the Sixth Army from being destroyed again. This time, they were on the roads of Ukraine. But he also knew that his men were on edge. The slightest delay, the slightest mistake, and they would all be overtaken by the Soviets. Night was falling, but the escape didn't stop. Shadows marched in the darkness, dragging backpacks, weapons, and wounded men. Lamps flickered, illuminating faces. Covered in mud, blood, and despair, the Dnieper was drawing ever closer. They could smell the damp scent of the cold water. But as they drew nearer, a cruel truth was revealed. There wouldn't be enough bridges for everyone, and the enemy kept coming, closer, faster, more aggressive. The race to the Dnieper was not just a military movement. It was a desperate attempt to escape a fate that had already been sealed once in Stalingrad. And now, as if history took pleasure in repeating tragedies, the Sixth Army was scrambling to avoid dying a second time. Kremenchuk's hell. An extended, epic, sinister and bloody version. When the Sixth Army finally sighted the smoking ruins of Kremenchuk, they understood immediately. This would not be a simple point of passage. This would be a sacrifice. The once vibrant city now resembled a charred carcass. Buildings with their facades torn off exposed their concrete skeletons. The streets were littered with bricks, debris, broken furniture and bodies. Many bodies. The air was so thick with smoke it burned the throat. The sky seemed permanently covered in soot. And amidst this devastation, the Sixth Army received its order. Defend Kremenchuk. Buy time, whatever the cost. That last sentence made even the veterans swallow hard. They knew exactly what it meant. The city becomes a deadly trap. The first Soviet grenades began to fall, even before the Germans had finished setting up their positions. Windows exploded as if they were made of paper, entire. Walls crumbled. With each impact, clouds of dust rose like ghosts taking shape. The Soviets advanced quickly, and the fighting began immediately. From corner to corner, from stairway to stairway, inside dark basements where the smell of mold mingled with the smell of fresh blood. The streets were narrow and treacherous. Every door could conceal an ambush. Every corpse could hide a mine. The Sixth Army, though exhausted, fought with desperate ferocity. It wasn't heroism, it was pure fear. If Kremenchuk fell too quickly, they would be caught before crossing the Dnieper. It was fight or die right there. Hand-to-hand combat, the worst part of war. The clashes quickly became so close that there was barely room for shots to be fired. Soldiers clung to each other like wild animals. Bayonets found flesh. Knives tore through uniforms. Hands became weapons when bullets ran out. Screams echoed through the dark corridors. Men stumbled over bodies. The floor was slippery with blood. In a partially destroyed house, a group of Germans held the line for almost 2 hours, using only grenades and chunks of concrete ripped from the wall. On another street, a Soviet T-34 advanced between burning buildings, illuminated by the flames like a metal monster. The German Panzerfausts were few, and many soldiers had to get close enough to touch the tank before they could destroy it. Few returned alive from these attempts. Civilians caught in the crossfire. Entire families hid in the basements, trembling, praying, waiting. When an explosion ripped off the roof, dust and wood fell on women and children, turning everything into chaos. Cries echoed alongside the roar of artillery, creating a macabre symphony. The sacrifice was worth it, but it came at too high a price. The fighting at Kremenchuk lasted long enough for a significant portion of the Sixth Army to continue its march to the Dnieper. Every minute gained cost dozens of lives. Every street defended was paid for with blood, bones, and smoke. In the end, when the city finally fell, Kremenchuk was no longer a place. It was an open tomb, an altar where the Sixth Army sacrificed hundreds of men to gain a few extra hours. The Soviets seized the city in a fury, but the price they paid was only a prelude to what was to come, crossing the Dnieper River, absolute chaos, the moment when hell would split in two. The Kremenchuk inferno had consumed hundreds of lives, but even so there was no time for mourning or rest. As soon as the survivors managed to escape the city's flaming ruins, they looked to the horizon and saw the Dnieper. The river seemed immense, silent, cold, almost indifferent to the approaching chaos. But the banks were far from signifying salvation. They were, in fact, the next nightmare. The road leading to the bridges was congested with broken-down vehicles, overcrowded carts, wounded soldiers dragging themselves along, and officers shouting orders that almost no one could hear. And then the crossing began under fire. Soviet artillery cleared a path through the sky with long howls, as if announcing the arrival of death. The first salvo struck the main bridge, making planks and beams vibrate like bones about to break. A column of smoke rose so high that for a moment the sun disappeared behind it. The crowd panicked. Soldiers tried to maintain order, but how could they control thousands of desperate men and civilians facing a monstrous river and an invisible enemy bombarding from afar? And Soviets knew exactly where to shoot. Each explosion hit the points where the most people were gathered. Trucks were lifted off the ground like toys and hurled into the water. Horses were torn apart by shrapnel. Men shouted orders, screamed for help, screamed without knowing why. And the bridge began to shake under the weight of everyone. Still, everyone moved forward, because standing still meant death. Those who couldn't reach the bridge attempted the crossing in increasingly desperate ways. Some entered the water with makeshift planks, others tied doors from destroyed houses together to use as rafts. Many simply threw themselves in, believing the current would be more merciful than the Soviets. They were wrong. The river was icy, brutal, merciless. Soldiers sank under the weight of their equipment. Wounded soldiers struggled to keep their heads above water. The current pulled bodies down, mixing blood with the slow movement of the waves. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was trying to take to the skies. But fuel was low, and Soviet fighters were numerous. The river trembled from the impact of the bombs. The smaller bridge, used for heavier vehicles, was hit directly. The explosion shattered wood, steel, and men. Screams echoed as part of the structure collapsed, dragging soldiers, trucks, and ammunition into the Dnieper. The sound of the water engulfing everything was almost as terrifying as the sound of the artillery. General Hollet observed everything from an elevated position, unable to do more than order in vain his troops to remain calm. The chaos was absolute. The Sixth Army, the same one that had been reborn after Stalingrad, now seemed poised to be split in two again, this time in the few meters separating a safe shore from a miserable death in the icy water. Still, with superhuman effort, some of the troops managed to reach the other side. Men crawled along the western bank, coughing, bleeding, shivering with cold, but alive. Others emerged from the river like specters, spitting water and mud. But many were left behind, trapped on the destroyed bridges, swallowed by the current or pulverized by the explosions. When night finally fell, the crossing was not yet over, but what was already clear was that the price had been monstrous. That passage had not been merely a retreat, it had been a massacre in motion. And what awaited the Sixth Army on the other side of the Dnieper was not rest, nor reinforcement, nor reorganization. It was simply a new order. As grim as the river they had just crossed, dig deep, fortify yourselves, and prepare to die. As night fell upon the Dnieper like a shroud woven of shadows and despair, the Sixth Army, a specter of its former glory, dragged itself to the western bank in an exodus of shattered souls. The echoes of the explosions still reverberated in the survivors' ears, mingling with the treacherous gurgling of the river that had swallowed them and spat them back out, soaked in icy waters impregnated with blood and debris. There was no pause to lick their wounds, not a moment of mercy to piece together the fragments of humanity that remained. A relentless directive, forged in the delusions of a distant Führer, fell upon them with the force of a final verdict. Fortify the eastern line of defense. Here, the Reich will stand unshakable or perish in the attempt. This line, proclaimed with pomp in the Berlin headquarters, was nothing more than a cruel mirage in the real theater of war. The Dnieper, that colossal serpent of murky waters that snaked through the Ukrainian vastness, had been the stage for ancient battles. Once, Cossacks and Tatars crossed its currents in bloody ambushes, and now, in the autumn of 1943, it became the threshold of a modern abyss. The men of the Sixth Army, remnants of carnages like Kharkiv and the infernos of Kursk, where tanks collided like mythological beasts in fields soaked in oil and flesh, knew that there were no ready-made walls awaiting them. Only the unforgiving earth, hardened by the incipient cold of Eastern Europe, where early frosts transformed the soil into an iron armor that resisted every blow of the shovel. General Karl-Adolf, his face scarred by past winters, the same winters that had frozen entire armies on the Russian steppes, turning soldiers into ice statues, watched the scene with eyes heavy with grim prophecies. He had commanded divisions across rivers like the Don and the Volga, where the original Sixth Army had been. Annihilated at Stalingrad, a catastrophe that echoed like a collective ghost in everyone's mind. Now, hastily reconstituted with inexperienced recruits and haunted veterans, the army was digging not defenses, but mass graves. Pollitt murmured low orders, his voice hoarse from the damp air, knowing that Hitler's maps ignored reality. The river, with its steep, floodable banks, was an unreliable ally, capable of betraying with sudden floods or fogs that concealed enemy advances. The chaos of the early hours was a pandemonium of palpable despair. Under the pale moon, peeking through heavy clouds, soldiers stumbled over exposed roots, digging trenches barely knee-deep, where river water seeped in like poison, turning the soil into sticky mud that clung to boots like the hands of drowning men. Some, with trembling hands and broken nails, piled up rubble from razed villages, stones from burned farms where Ukrainian peasants had been massacred in brutal retaliations during the German occupation. Others, lacking proper tools, used helmets as makeshift shovels, the metal creaking against the earth as blisters of blood formed on reopened calluses. And looming over it all, primal dread. The river whispered dark secrets, carrying echoes of Soviet cannons from the other side, where the Red Army, fueled by the fury of recent victories at Orel and Belgorod, amassed forces like an inescapable storm. Hunger devoured them from within, an invisible monster more merciless than any. Bombardment, meager rations, remnants of supplies looted from ghost villages, those same villages where Ukrainian partisans ambushed German convoys on moonless nights, were shared in minuscule portions. One soldier, perhaps a young man from Berlin who had dreamed of Wagnerian glories, shared a rusty can of canned meat with comrades whose faces were masks of living skulls, their eyes sunken with deprivation. The air, thick and oppressive, carried the stench of decay. Bloated bodies floated. Downstream, victims of failed crossings, mingling with the metallic smell of gunpowder and the acrid sweat of men on the verge of collapse. Voracious insects, drawn by the chaos, buzzed like harbingers of plague, biting exposed skin as the soldiers struggled to ignore the devouring emptiness in their stomachs. The morality, once forged in the fire of Nazi ideals, now crumbled like the eroded banks of the Dnieper. Veterans of brutal campaigns in Poland in 1939, where cities like Warsaw were reduced to rubble in relentless bombing raids, exchanged blank stares with terrified newcomers. Night whispers echoed like final confessions. Stories of brothers lost in Smolensk, where dense forests swallowed entire divisions in partisan ambushes, or of nights in Rostov, where the Siberian cold claimed lives more efficiently than bullets. Some, driven mad by terror, stared at the river as a portal to oblivion, contemplating the final plunge into waters that had already claimed thousands. Hysterical laughter occasionally erupted, echoing like the cackles of demons, while others prayed silently, invoking indifferent gods in a pagan land scarred by ancient Slavic battles. And then the sounds, oh, the sounds that pierced the darkness like blades. Beyond the river, the guttural roar of Soviet T-34 engines, those indomitable tanks that had crushed German lines at Prokhorovka during the Great Summer Offensive, grew like distant thunder. It was the prelude to an apocalypse. The Red Army, fueled by vengeance for besieged Leningrad and threatened Moscow, mobilized millions in a human and mechanical tide. Every vibration in the air was a reminder that time was running out, that the makeshift defenses, mere shallow trenches strewn with rusty MG-42 machine guns and haphazardly scattered mines, would be swept away like dry leaves. The Luftwaffe, once mistress of the skies that had blitzkriegized Europe from Dunkirk to Crete, was now a pathetic shadow. Mi-109 planes, their fuselages, scarred by flak holes and pilots whose eyes burned with fatigue after suicidal missions over the Caucasus, barely took off. Fuel, scarce as hope, was rationed for desperate escapes, leaving the Sixth Army naked under Soviet air dominance. Ilyushin Stumoviks, the flying tanks that had decimated panzer columns at Kursk, hovered like vultures, ready to descend in deadly dives. At daybreak, when the grey light of the Ukrainian dawn, that dawn which illuminated once fertile fields, now riddled with shell craters, revealed the pathetic positions, a collective chill snaked through the ranks. The trenches, irregular and shallow, seemed like open veins in the earth, inviting blood to flow. The fleeting relief of surviving the night dissolved into raw terror. Those defenses, erected tooth and nail on a shoreline that echoed Napoleon's defeats on the same steps, would not withstand the approaching Red Fury. The eastern line of defense was a fallacy, a sandcastle before a tsunami of steel and fury. However, there they remained, shackled by the inexorable decree, by the fear of court-martial, and by the tenuous illusion that resilience could defy the inevitable. The Dnieper, silent witness to fallen empires, from the Mongol Khans to the Russian Tsars, now watched them, ready to swallow yet another legion into its unfathomable depths. Each breath was an act of defiance against the growing terror, a whisper of dread that echoed. The avalanche would come, and with it, the end. At the dawn of a grey and unforgiving day, when the rising sun barely managed to pierce the mist that clung to the Dnieper like a shroud of restless souls, the sentinels of the Sixth Army felt a primal shiver run down their spines. That fog, woven from cold dampness and remnants of night smoke, began to dissolve into ethereal wisps, revealing not only the river in its treacherous vastness, but a spectacle of biblical proportions that would make even the most hardened warriors question the sanity of the world. On the other side, the Soviet Colossus emerged, a living and voracious entity, forged in the crucibles of Siberian winters and scorching summers, driven by the inextinguishable wrath of a nation that had suffered barbaric invasions since the time of the Mongols, but now rose as the ultimate avenger. It was no mere army, it was a red avalanche, a leviathan of steel and determination stretching beyond the limits of human vision. Endless columns snaked across the steppes, echoing the great migrations of nomadic peoples who once crossed those lands, but now laden with modern war machines. Robust and tireless gas trucks hauled 150-kilometer howitzers whose barrels rose like accusing fingers pointed toward the western sky. artillery tractors, heirs to the engineering forces that had broken through the lines at Smolensk and Voronezh, positioned themselves in precise formations, while T-34 tanks, those armored predators that had massacred panzers at Prokhorovka, where the clang of metal mingled with the cries of the dying, lined up in seemingly endless rows, their tracks churning the earth in a low, ominous roar. The smoke from diesel engines hung like a prophetic veil, and between the machines, hordes of soldiers in earthy uniforms, armed with PPSH-41s, that spat death in furious bursts, moved with the synchronicity of a collective organism, nourished by the doctrine of commissars who invoked the spirit of past revolutions. The German scouts, those exhausted spectres who had infiltrated the shadows of the previous night, whispering reports of enemy movements similar to those that preceded the siege at Kharkov, had not prepared anyone for such magnitude. The Red Army, reconstituted after the carnage of Leningrad, where the blockade had transformed humans into walking skeletons, hungry for retribution, and strengthened by the victories at Orel, where the Soviet artillery had proven its mastery in barrages that pulverized fortifications, now manifested itself as a primal force. It was as if the steppes, witnesses to ancient battles between Slavs and Teutons, had given birth to an invincible titan, coordinated by generals like Zhukov, whose tactics of operational depth, inherited from the strategies that turned the tide in Moscow when the ice halted the invaders, transformed multitudes into a symphony of destruction. In the precarious trenches of the Western Bank, the soldiers of the Sixth Army froze in a sepulchral silence, their faces as pale as the frost that had once frozen entire armies at the gates of Stalingrad. Veterans, whose scars told tales of winters where the cold claimed more lives than bullets, swallowed hard, feeling their hearts pound like execution drums. Others, rookies recruited from the streets of Vienna or Berlin, closed their eyes in silent prayers, evoking memories of campaigns in Poland where cities were reduced to ashes in merciless blitzes, but nothing comparable to this. The air carried an oppressive weight, as if the atmosphere itself contracted in anticipation, and even the crows, those black messengers that had hovered over battlefields since the wars of the Tsars, seemed to have fled far away, leaving only the distant hum of engines as a prelude to the chaos. Suddenly, without a whisper of warning, the abyss opened. Soviet artillery, that hydra of flaming barrels that had pulverized fortresses at Sevastopol, where the Black Sea had been stained with blood, unleashed its fury as if the gods of Olympus had declared war on mortals. The first salvos echoed like primordial thunder, tearing the sky and making the ground convulse in violent spasms. Successive explosions, so dense that they merged into a continuous roar, hurled men into the air like broken dolls, while craters opened like hungry mouths, swallowing earth, rubble, and torn limbs. The rising dust eclipsed the rising sun, transforming dawn into a premature twilight, where the smell of cordite mingled with the stench of burnt earth and exposed entrails. Screams echoed through the pandemonium, some of raw terror, others of stunned confusion, as soldiers clung to the ground, their trenches becoming precarious tombs against the deluge of fire that shattered makeshift barricades, splintered ancient tree trunks, and crushed bones against the underlying rock. The barrage persisted in an eternal torment, minutes that stretched like ages, evoking the marathon bombing raids at Kursk, where the air trembled with the weight of thousands of tons of explosives. Each detonation was a divine hammer, weakening the German defenses as if they were eggshells. And when the roar finally subsided, leaving a deafening buzz in the ears of the survivors, the relief was illusory, a cruel pause before the peak of horror. Then, emerging from the remaining mists, were the infernal vessels, heirs to the epic crossings of the Don and Volga rivers, where floating bridges had sealed the destinies of nations. Assault boats, rudimentary rafts built from ancient Forest trunks, those same forests that sheltered partisans in nighttime ambushes, ingenious pontoons and PT-34 amphibious tanks that cut through the waters like prehistoric crocodiles. Behind them, inexorable waves of Soviet infantry, disciplined as the Roman legions that once marched across the plains, descended the steep banks with gleaming bayonets and cries of "Ura" that echoed like ancient curses. It was a human tide, driven by the memory of villages incinerated in Belarus and Ukraine, where the occupation had sown seeds of eternal hatred. For the Germans, that sight was soul-crushing, like witnessing the sea rise in fury against the land, evoking the great floods that had drowned invading armies in centuries past. Gripping Mauser rifles with trembling hands, adjusting rusty bayonets, and wiping eyes blurred by soot and involuntary tears, they prepared for the inevitable. The Dnieper, that ancient guardian of disputed borders since the time of the Varangian Vikings, would soon be stained scarlet, a river of blood where lives would intertwine in a deadly embrace. The battle had not merely begun, it awoke like an ancient dragon, ready to devour everything in its path, leaving only echoes of terror and ruins in its wake. The invisible siege. The trap closes in around the Sixth Army. The Sixth Army still believed it had room to retreat, reorganize, or perhaps receive reinforcements. But that space was running out, and fast. It all began with a strange, heavy silence. Like before a storm, German patrols returned with increasingly grim reports, villages disappearing in silence. Soviet columns were appearing where, theoretically, there shouldn't be anyone, and roads were littered with the footprints of enemy infantry, cavalry, and tanks. It was as if the Red Army was everywhere at once. In the hut that served as an advance command post, Hollitt received new maps marked in red pen. Each new line was a stab at hope. Soviet arrows came from the north, the east, and the south. The Dnieper Bridge, which should have been their lifeline, now seemed like a noose being slowly pulled around the neck of the Sixth Army. The German advanced units were beginning to disappear. First, a battalion, then a company, then nothing but smoke on the horizon. The Soviets were practicing their favorite art, surround without warning. They cut roads, sabotaged railways, destroyed depots, and eliminated isolated outposts. And when they finally attacked, they came like a whirlwind, with mortars, cannons, T-34 tanks, and waves of infantry that seemed endless. The German soldiers sensed the change in the air. The noise of distant machine guns became constant, like a clock marking the countdown to final destruction. Messengers arrived covered in mud and blood, warning that entire Soviet columns were emerging behind the German lines, completely cutting off escape routes. The siege wasn't complete on paper yet, but in practice, it had already happened. The troops found themselves pushed further and further west, always running, always defending themselves, but never having time to breathe. They slept for minutes at a time, ate only crumbs of frozen bread, and fought with limited ammunition. The most superstitious began to say they were reliving Stalingrad, only worse. At least in Stalingrad, they knew where they were surrounded. Here, the prison was invisible, silent, and closed in 1 inch at a time. It was in this moment of growing despair that Hollitt finally understood the Sixth Army was about to relive its nightmare, to die again, this time on the banks of the Dnieper. The cursed bridge, the final path to salvation. The bridge over the Dnieper, the last escape route, the last promise of survival, became the Sixth Army's greatest nightmare. For days, Hitler had ordered it defended at all costs, as if it were a magic gate that would stop the Soviet advance. But when the invisible siege began to materialize, the bridge went from a symbol of resistance to a symbol of absolute panic. The German troops approaching were in tatters, torn uniforms, boots covered in frozen mud, empty eyes, and carrying makeshift wounded on doors ripped from destroyed houses. The road leading to the main access looked like a death corridor. Soviet machine guns, hidden amidst the fog and burnt trees, fired incessantly, turning every meter into a bloody obstacle. Desperate German engineers struggled to keep the bridge intact. Working under constant bombardment, they reinforced pillars that swayed like crushed bones. The wood burned, the iron twisted, and pieces of the deck fell into the icy black river below. Some soldiers, overcome with fear, ran towards the bridge without waiting for orders, only to be shot down before reaching its beginning. Traffic was chaotic. Horses balked, trucks broke down, armored vehicles got stuck. And in the midst of that hell, the Soviets intensified their artillery attacks, hitting columns caught in the confusion squarely. Explosions illuminated the early morning, revealing silhouettes of men running in panic and shadows projected onto the turbulent waters of the Dnieper. For Hollit, each report that came in was worse than the last. Northern sector lost. Russian artillery advancing. T-34 crossing the forest. The bridge could collapse at any moment. He knew that if the bridge collapsed, the Sixth Army would be doomed to annihilation. No chance of a miracle. No chance of escape, no chance of a repeat of what remained of Stalingrad. And then, as if fate had waited only for the ideal moment to crush the last German hope, came the final attack. Waves of Katyusha rockets roared through the air, tearing the sky with their metallic cries. Rockets rained down like fire on the bridge. Flames rose, timbers exploded. Soldiers were hurled into the river, and a dull sound echoed through the early morning hours, the sound of a massive structure collapsing under the weight of chaos. The bridge was still, standing but by a thread, and everyone knew that from that moment on, every second it held would be fought for with blood. The path to salvation was crumbling, and with it, the fate of the Sixth Army. Steel and ice. The final battle for the banks of the Dnieper. With the bridge on the verge of collapse, the Sixth Army found itself forced to fight not for victory, but for minutes. Every minute they managed to hold back, the Soviets meant a few more men crossing to the other side. It was a race against time, against the enemy, and against death itself. The day dawned grey, cold, and heavy. The wind cut like a blade, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder, burnt oil, and blood. The banks of the Dnieper have become a living hell. There was no longer a front line. Everything was chaos. German soldiers took shelter behind burning trucks, makeshift trenches, roofless houses, anything that could protect them from the raging storm of fire. The Soviet T-34s emerged like steel creatures from the fog, their engines roaring like hungry beasts. Chains crushed the soaked earth, sending mud and dirty snow flying in all directions. Behind them, waves of infantry advanced shouting, throwing grenades, opening continuous fire. It was as if the earth itself was spitting out enemies. The Germans responded with everything they had. Anti-tank guns fired until their barrels burned, turning some Russian armored vehicles into orange fireballs. MG-42 machine guns swept through enemy infantry with bursts so fast they sounded like a zipper being zipped shut at breakneck speed. But for every Soviet soldier that fell, it seemed 3 new ones appeared. The ground trembled. Trees split like matches. Men shouted orders that no one else could hear. The snow, once white, was now a brown and red carpet, a mixture of mud, blood, and pieces of torn uniforms. And amidst this chaos, a brutal truth became clear. The Sixth Army was fighting just to exist for a few more moments. The wounded were carried to the bridge on makeshift stretchers, some still conscious, others delirious, calling for mothers, wives, or comrades already dead. The doctors, covered in blood up to their elbows, did the impossible with dirty bandages, scarce morphine, and broken instruments. Soviet artillery relentlessly struck German positions mercilessly. With each explosion, bodies were thrown into the air like mannequins. Sometimes the impact was so strong it ripped the air from their lungs, leaving men on their knees, stunned, unable to understand where they were, and yet they did not back down, because behind them lay the abyss, the bridge hanging by threads, salvation crumbling, and ahead the Red Army, relentless and insatiable. There on the banks of the Dnieper, the Sixth Army fought not to win, but to avoid disappearing at that very moment. It was the last gasp before the fall, the final confrontation before total collapse. The ice cracked, the steel screamed. Death lurked around every inch of that devastated ground. The disintegration. The Sixth Army falls apart. When night fell, it wasn't darkness, it was complete blackout, as if the world had decided to extinguish any remaining hope. The Sixth Army was no longer an army, but a collection of isolated, fragmented men trying to survive by instinct. The lines of command had collapsed. Battalions became platoons. Platoons became groups of 10, 5, sometimes just 2 soldiers trembling with cold and terror. The radio, which was supposed to coordinate the defense, transmitted only static and desperate pleas. "We need ammunition." The artillery disappeared. "They are everywhere. Hollit, respond! Hollit!" And then nothing, just suffocating silence. The disintegration was both physical and moral. Some men wandered among smoking craters, unsure if they were retreating, advancing, or simply walking in circles. Others dug holes in the ice with their bare hands, trying to create shelter where there was none. There were soldiers who fought to their last cartridge. Others, exhausted beyond human limits, sat in the snow, leaned against wreckage, and let their minds fade, as if accepting death were less painful than continuing to run from it. The fire from the explosions illuminated brutal scenes. An officer trying to lift unresponsive soldiers, a group carrying a wounded man whose leg hung by a thread of skin, a sergeant yelling orders to men deafened by the bombardment. Reality had dissolved into absolute chaos. Meanwhile, the Red Army tightened its grip. Armored units advanced through the darkness without headlights, guided only by shadows and the heat of battle. Soviet patrols appeared out of nowhere, cutting through isolated groups, capturing or executing survivors. The frozen mud was colorless. It was a macabre mosaic of dried blood, shrapnel, and twisted bodies. Amid the collapse, some officers desperately tried to improvise new defensive lines, but it was futile. With each attempt, Soviet tanks broke through like iron hammers, shattering glass. The structure of the Sixth Army, its discipline, its hierarchy, its very existence, was being crushed. It was like watching a giant die in slow motion, each limb torn away by relentless forces. And, for the second time in the war, the German Sixth Army, reborn from the ashes of Stalingrad, was being destroyed before the very eyes of its destiny. Here, on the banks of the Dnieper, it was finally shattered, without glory, without a chance of recovery, without forgiveness. A fragmented, cruel, and inevitable death, the end that Stalingrad had begun, the Dnieper was bringing to a close. The dying roar, when duty collides with the impossible night along the Dnieper, did not simply fall, it collapsed, swallowing what little remained of German order. And as the cold deepened, something even more brutal happened. The last spark of coordinated resistance began flickering out. Yet, in those final hours, pockets of men still clung to their duty with a kind of desperate fury, the kind that only appears when a soldier knows he is fighting in the last chapter of his own life. They fought not for Hitler, not for glory, and certainly not for victory, but for the man beside them. Flares shot into the sky, painting the battlefield with harsh bursts of white light. For a moment, the world became a frozen photograph. Men crouched behind overturned wagons, machine gunners firing until their hands blistered, officers waving pistols, their breath turning to steam as they shouted orders that were instantly devoured by the wind. And beyond them, lurking in the darkness, the Red Army closed in with the relentless certainty of winter itself. Every explosion echoed through the valley like a drum announcing the end. Trees shattered, earth churned, and fragments of frozen soil rained down like shrapnel. The Dnieper, that black, icy serpent, reflected the red glow of burning equipment, as if the river itself were absorbing the death of the Sixth Army. In another time, another war, another century, legends would speak of heroic last stands. But this was not legend. It was the grim, unvarnished reality of the Eastern Front, a place where hope froze faster than water. Groups of German infantry, cut off from command and nearly out of ammunition, still formed makeshift firing lines. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow, loading rifles with trembling fingers, teeth chattering, eyes wild with exhaustion. When Soviet infantry charged, their silhouettes multiplied through the fog, turning them into phantoms of the steppe, ghosts of an empire rising to devour everything in its path. Yet, the Germans fired and fired and fired until rifles clicked empty, until barrels smoked, until the heat of battle burned through the numbness of frostbite. And still the Soviets came. Somewhere amid this chaos, an old sergeant, a veteran from the early days of the war, a survivor of the marches through Poland and France, clung to a shattered piece of trench wall. His once grey uniform was now the colour of mud and blood. He muttered to a terrified young recruit beside him, This is what the Eastern Front truly is. Not the maps, not the speeches. This is the price." He raised his rifle one last time as Soviet shadows loomed over the ridge. The boy beside him followed, not because he thought he would live, but because in 1943, along the Dnieper, there was no other choice. Their shots cracked through the night like the dying roar of a beast that refuses to fall silently. The Sixth Army, reborn, rebuilt, and sent back into the fire, was collapsing again. But it collapsed fighting, in a blaze of desperation that would carve its final moments into the ice and mud of the Ukrainian steppe. The river watched, the winter howled, and history turned another page drenched in blood. The bridge of desperation. Seconds paid. In blood by dawn, the Dnieper no longer looked like a river. It looked like a graveyard. A black, freezing corridor lined with smoke, wreckage, and bodies half buried in snow. The bridge, that fragile artery of survival, creaked and groaned under the weight of retreating soldiers. Every step across its shattered planks felt like stepping between life and oblivion. The sun, pale and weak, tried to rise, but even its light seemed afraid to touch the horror unfolding below. German soldiers stumbled toward the bridge in broken waves. Some limped on blood-soaked bandages. Others carried wounded comrades whose eyes fluttered between consciousness and the dark beyond. The air stank of gasoline, burnt rubber, gunpowder, and the metallic scent of spilled blood. Above them, the sky rumbled. Soviet aircraft circling like vultures waiting to strike again. On the eastern bank, the Red Army pressed forward with the cold precision of an iron machine. Mortar shells landed closer and closer, each explosion shaking the bridge as if trying to tear it from the earth. Splinters of wood and shards of steel whistled past fleeing soldiers, slicing through coats, flesh, and hope alike. And yet they kept moving, because standing still meant death. Some officers tried to maintain order, shouting commands that their frost-bitten throats struggled to form. Keep moving! Keep moving! Don't stop! Don't look back!" But many did look back, and what they saw would stay with them forever. The eastern shore, once held by German defense lines, was now a living storm of Soviet armor. T-34s crashed through abandoned trenches, their tracks grinding helmets and rifles beneath them. Soviet infantry advanced in dense formations, their silhouettes stretching like a tide that refused to ebb. Machine gun nests that had held through the night were overrun within minutes. The few German gunners who remained fired until they were engulfed by flame or bayonets. The cries of wounded men were drowned out by the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. This was no longer a battle, it was a flood, and the Germans were being swept away. At the foot of the bridge, a field medic dropped to his knees beside a soldier whose chest was torn open by shrapnel. The dying man clutched the medic's sleeve, eyes full of fear, whispering a single word, "Mama!" The medic froze, then forced himself to pull away as a new barrage slammed into the riverbank. He ran, tears mixing with soot on his cheeks, because he knew what the soldier had known. Staying meant becoming part of the charred landscape. Halfway across, the bridge cracked again, a long, agonizing scream of splintering wood. Several men fell through a collapsing section, plunging into the icy water below. Their screams were short. The cold took them instantly. Still, the retreat continued. Hollett watched from a distance, his face grey, his eyes hollow. He understood now. The Sixth Army was not retreating. It was bleeding out. Every meter gained on that collapsing bridge was paid for by another explosion. Another scream, another life extinguished. And behind them the Red Army kept advancing, unstoppable as winter itself. The bridge of desperation held for another hour. An hour purchased with more courage, fear, and sacrifice than any general's report would ever capture. But everyone knew its fall was no longer a matter of if, only when. The Shattering. When the Dnieper swallowed the Sixth Army, the moment everyone feared, the moment everyone knew was coming, arrived not with a single explosion, but with a terrible rolling groan that echoed across the frozen river like the death rattle of a titan. The bridge, battered by artillery, scorched by fire, and overloaded with men, equipment, and terror, finally began to give way. At first it was subtle, a tremor underfoot, a vibration through the beams. Soldiers paused mid-step, gripping the railings with numb fingers. Someone shouted, "Keep moving! Go! Go!" But deep beneath their boots, the Dnieper murmured a different command: collapse. Then came the crack, a sharp, violent snap of wood and steel tearing apart. The entire structure jerked sideways. Men lost their balance, grabbing at anything: ropes, comrades, shadows. A sergeant fell to his knees, clutching at the boards, screaming for someone to pull him up. But the boards beneath him split open, like ribs being pried apart, and the bridge began to fall. A section near the center dropped first, the planks folding downward, as if the river were opening its jaws. Dozens of soldiers slid into the gap, their helmets bouncing against beams, their screams cutting through the thunder of collapsing timber. They hit the water with hollow splashes, disappearing under black waves that closed over them like a hand smothering a candle. Those who could swim tried, but the Dnieper in October was no river. It was liquid death. Within seconds, the icy water froze muscles, stole breath, and dragged men down with the weight of their gear. Arms reached out desperate, pleading, then sank silently into the depths. On the western bank, German officers shouted for engineers, but there were no more engineers. Most were dead, buried in cratered ice, or floating somewhere beneath the surface of the river. The remaining portion of the bridge continued to twist and sag, each groan louder than the last. A truck loaded with ammunition slid sideways, its wheels scraping against the broken planks. For a moment, it hung suspended, a grotesque statue of destruction. Then, it toppled, crashing into the water in a burst of fire and steam. On the eastern bank, the Red Army saw the collapse and surged forward with renewed fury. Mortars rained down on the river crossing. Bullets whipped across the air, slicing through exposed men still clinging to the ruins of the bridge. A machine gun crew tried to lay suppressing fire, but a shell obliterated them in a spray of snow and shrapnel. Panic spread. Discipline cracked. The fear of drowning, burning, or being overrun consumed the retreat. Hollett, watching from a ridge, felt the bottom drop out of his soul. In Stalingrad, Paulus had been trapped by a ring of steel. Here, Hollett was witnessing his army's escape route, its lifeline being torn apart plank by plank right in front of him. The bridge gave one final tortured scream. It twisted, it buckled, it tore itself away from the shore and collapsed completely into the Dnieper with a roar that drowned out both armies. A shockwave of water and debris sprayed upward, drenching the survivors. The river swallowed what remained. Beams, bodies, crates, helmets, dreams, everything. The cries from the water were faint, brief, and then nothing. Silence. The Sixth Army's last path to salvation was gone. The Dnieper had chosen its tribute. And as the smoke drifted away, it was clear to everyone, Germans and Soviets alike, that what had just died on that river was not a penis uma ponte, but the final hope of an army already haunted by one destruction, now condemned to repeat its fate. The Western Bank chaos, an army without a shadow. When the bridge vanished into the freezing black of the Dnieper, The Western Bank erupted into a scene so chaotic, so unhinged, that even veterans of Stalingrad would later swear they had never witnessed anything like it. It was as if the collapse had torn not so a rota de fuga, but the very sanity of the Sixth Army. Thousands of men, officers, infantry, drivers, wounded, clerks, cooks, all suddenly found themselves trapped against the river with no bridge, no boats, no plan, and no hope. What remained of the German rear turned into a whirlwind of panic and despair. The first sound was shouting, not organized commands, but raw, primal screaming. Some soldiers begged for engineers to rebuild the bridge, though everyone knew there were no materials, no time, and barely any surviving engineers. Others scrambled along the riverbank, searching in vain for rafts, planks, anything that could float. They pulled doors off ruined houses, ripped wheels from carts, even tied barrels together with telephone wire. But each crude raft capsized within seconds, dumping men into icy death. Machine gunners, now with no line to protect, fired reflexively at shadows. Officers tried to form firing lines, but their voices drowned in a sea of terror. Horses reared and panicked, breaking free and stampeding through crowds of soldiers, trampling the weak and wounded. A young corporal, his face ghostly pale, clutched the collar of an older sergeant. "What do we do? What do we do now?" The sergeant stared into the fog, lips trembling. "Pray it ends quickly, boy." Behind them, the Red Army closed in. Artillery shells crashed into the western shore, exploding among clusters of retreating troops. One blast turned a group of 20 men into red mist. Another shell ignited a fuel truck, sending a fireball rolling across the snow and lighting up the night like a miniature sun. The smell was unbearable. Burning flesh, diesel smoke, wet wool, and the cold rot of river water. Blood mixed with mud, forming red rivulets that trickled down toward the river. Medical tents collapsed as shells tore through them, throwing bandages, morphine bottles, and human limbs into the air. Medics, overwhelmed and shaking, abandoned their stations and ran with the rest. The wounded, those who couldn't walk, screamed after the fleeing soldiers, their voices cracking with fear. "Don't leave us, please, please!" But no one could stop. Death was coming too quickly, from too many directions. In the distance, Soviet tank engines growled like approaching beasts. Their silhouettes appeared through the fog, gun barrels glowing faintly from constant firing. Machine gun tracers stitched red lines through the air, cutting down anyone who tried to reorganize. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. It had become a mass of frightened men trying to outrun fate on a riverbank that had nowhere left to give. Hollett watched the disintegration unfold, unable to speak. His command posts were gone, his staff scattered, his maps useless. He reached for his field radio, but the only sound was static, and distant Soviet victory songs carried by the wind. This was not a retreat, not an orderly withdrawal, not even a rout. This was obliteration, the final unraveling of an army already condemned. And as the Red Army tightened the noose, one truth became undeniable. The Western Bank had become a trap, as deadly as Stalingrad itself. There was no more running, only the end, the final breath. The Sixth Army dies. A second time, by the time the Red Army's front ranks emerged fully through the morning mist, the last remnants of the German Sixth Army were no longer soldiers. They were living specters, broken men who walked like shadows over the bloodied mud of the Western Bank. The battle was over, but death was still collecting what was owed. The Soviets advanced in an eerie, almost solemn silence. It wasn't haste, it wasn't anger, it was certainty. They knew that victory was right there in front of them, within their reach. The Sixth Army had no way to fight anymore. They had no ammunition. They had no organization. They had no bridges. They had nothing. And even so, some still resisted. In a line of trees split by artillery fire, a group of Germans set up a last makeshift position. The MG-42 fired a few more bursts, spitting out belts of bullets with what remained of its strength. Not to win, to delay the capture for a few seconds, perhaps to prevent more comrades from falling prisoner to the enemy before they reached the safety of the German rear, kilometers behind. But the rear guard no longer existed. They didn't know yet. Soviets surrounded the position from both sides, and the last machine gun fell silent in a matter of seconds, swallowed by the crossfire. A man fell face down in the snow, leaving a red trail that spread like ink. Further on, a German officer slowly raised his hands, his empty pistol dangling from his frozen fingers. Other soldiers imitated him, not out of cowardice, but out of utter exhaustion. The war had drained everything from them. It was the end of the body, the end of the mind, the end of resistance. The Red Army shouted orders. Weapons were thrown to the ground. The men were lined up in columns like prisoners. Most were so weak they could barely stand. A corporal, covered in dried blood, sank to his knees, tears freezing on his face. He looked at the grey sky, murmuring something no one heard. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a plea for forgiveness, or perhaps just a goodbye. Nearby, General Hollet, the man in charge of reviving the fallen army of Stalingrad, received the news he had been carrying in his heart. His training no longer existed. I was lost, consumed, destroyed for the second time in less than a year. But now there would be no reconstruction. There would be no rebirth. There would be no turning back. What remained of the Sixth Army, wounded, starving, frozen, marched into Soviet captivity. Many would never reach the camps alive. Winter, disease, and brutality would do the final work. Behind them, the Dnieper River flowed silently, carrying with it pieces of bridge, helmet shells, broken bayonets, and the last hopes of one of the most famous, feared, and doomed formations of the Second World War. In the end, the river not only witnessed the fall, he consumed the Sixth Army. The battle was over, and in the icy silence that enveloped the western shore, a truth echoed in the heavy morning air. The German Sixth Army died twice in World War II, but in the Dnieper, he died forever. As the smoke slowly drifted over the Dnieper and the echoes of artillery faded into the cold evening air, the final chapter of the German Sixth Army was carved into history, not with triumph, but with endurance soaked in blood. What remained of Hollet's men stood among the ruins of villages burned to ash, staring across a river that had become both their prison and their grave. They were soldiers who had been resurrected from Stalingrad's corpse, only to be dragged once more into a nightmare where survival was measured not in victories, but in hours lived. By now, uniforms were nothing but rags, weapons little more than extensions of trembling hands, and hopes reduced to embers. The Dnieper fortress that Hitler promised had never existed, not in any real physical sense. The river had been a line on a map, a fantasy of resistance against a Soviet war machine too vast to stop. Yet these men, broken and forgotten, had made it real in the only way possible, through their blood. On the eastern horizon, the Red Army continued its advance, unstoppable, relentless, like a tide of steel rolling toward the heart of the Reich. And the Sixth Army, pressed to the limit, fought not for strategy anymore, not for glory, but for the simple right to keep breathing. But even breath became a luxury. One by one, positions collapsed. One by one, units were swallowed by the Soviet counter-offensive. One by one, the last flickers of German resistance were snuffed out along the riverbanks. Still, in that chaos, something undeniably human endured. There were moments, fleeting, fragile, when a wounded soldier shared his last sip of water with a comrade, when officers refused to abandon their men, when small pockets of infantry made impossible stands simply because surrender felt like betrayal to the fallen. These moments didn't change the outcome, but they defined the battle's soul. And when the end finally came, it was not with drums or banners or proclamations. It was with silence, a silence heavy enough to crush the spirit, a silence the survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. The Sixth Army, reborn from the ashes of Stalingrad, had walked into its second death. Not a death of annihilation, but a death of exhaustion, of being bled dry by a war that had already ended for them long before them. Last shot was fired. The Dnieper flowed on, indifferent, eternal, carrying with it the whispers of thousands who fought and fell on its shores. Their story would merge with the great river of World War II's tragedies, another chapter in the long chronicle of human suffering and endurance beneath the shadow of tyranny and ambition. In the end, the legacy of the last stand of the German Sixth Army was not carved by Hitler, nor by Soviet marshals, nor by maps in distant headquarters. It was carved by the men themselves, men who stood against a storm they could never stop, men who fought long after hope had died, men whose footsteps still echo softly along the Dnieper's banks, carried on the cold wind like a final haunting salute. This was their death. This was their stand. This was the Dnieper.